Professor Beckles is the 8th Vice-Chancellor of UWI, and he's a distinguished academic, international thought leader, United Nations Committee official, and global public activist in the field of social justice and minority empowerment. He's also served as an advisor on UNESCO's Cities for Peace global program. He has a number of notable publications, including White Servitude and Black Slavery, the First Black Slave Society, Britain's Barbados and Britain's Black Debt, Reparations for Slavery and Native Genocide in the Caribbean, to name but a few. And all of those publications, plus others, are relevant to today's learnings. So again, with no further ado, please welcome Professor Sir Hilary Beckles from the University of West Indies. Good evening, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so very much. Allow me to recognize, of course, the Mayor of London, Sadiq, and his deputy, Dr. Debbie Weeks Bernard, and to also recognize the chair of the London Assembly, Andrew Boff, and to say what a tremendous honor it was just to sit and listen to Nairobi Thompson speaking so eloquently on such a terrible subject, but so deeply philosophical and riveting. And thank you, Nairobi. Thank you. It is entirely appropriate, I would wish to begin by noting that for the City of London to participate in the remembering of the UNESCO Day in respect to slavery, the slave trade, and of course, abolition. It is appropriate because what we are gathered here to speak about this day is the greatest crime ever committed against humanity. And London was at the heart of it. It's a crime whose harm and suffering continues to haunt humanity in this 21st century. It's a crime that has anchored the evolving 21st century within a legacy of untold human suffering that, and there is no carpet in the world that's big enough to brush this under. For centuries, the City of London, as the financial heart of its nation, gave definition, shape, and form and sustainability to this crime. Indeed, London rose to become the world's financial institution, a reputation and status it sustained for over 200 years because of this crime, because of its capacity to structure, define, and sustain a slave trading and chain and chattel Africans for 300 years. And no other city in the world knew how best to do this than the City of London. And so easily it brushed aside Amsterdam, that competed for that status, and so easily it brushed aside Amsterdam to emerge without rival as the center of an imperial structure, a global imperial structure in which slave trading and slavery were the existential cause of that global imperial model. Without the capacity, the skills, and the commitment of the political leadership of the city and the corporate managers of the city, the slave complex would not have evolved as rapidly and spread as globally as it did. It's impossible to speak about slavery. It's impossible to speak about slave trading without understanding the city of London, the mother of that crime. I was born on the small island of Barbados, and Barbados was the first project and product of the city of London. The very first map that was ever drawn of Barbados was drawn in 1657, just 30 years after it was financed by the merchants of London, the enterprise that captured this island from the native people and made it a British enterprise property, was financed by the merchants of the city of London. And on that map, one third of the island is described as the property of the merchants of London. This is the very first map ever drawn of Barbados, 1657. And a third of the island, in fact, one would say the best third, because of the agricultural land, because this was the place that the city of London had deemed to begin sugar plantation slavery in the Americas. This was the project of the city of London, to establish plantations, to bring 6,000 West Africans, mostly Ghanaians at the time, across the Atlantic into Barbados to begin this project of slavery. City of London then produced all of the relevant institutions, the financial institutions, the political institutions, the leadership, and the social institutions that enabled this enterprise to flourish into the greatest economic system of the world, slave plantation, chattel slavery. There was no enterprise in the world, there was no institution in the world that was larger, greater than the slave complex, the slave trading, the slave manufacturing, production, and the city of London was at the heart of this enterprise. It is important to hear the voice of the mayor of London to reflect upon this history, because the mayors of London, they were the ones who hosted the slave owners. They were the ones who legitimized the slave owners. They were in themselves some of the primary slave owners in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. It were the mayors of London who not only managed the money generated by slavery, they managed the message that erupted about white supremacy, about the fact that African people were not human beings, that they were property, they were chattel, they were real estate, they were non-human. It was the messaging that enabled this enterprise to go on for centuries, that emerged out of the institutions of the city of London. Returning once again to Barbados. In 1816, the African people rose up on this island and fought a battle for 7 days against the enslavers. After 7 days of warfare on this small, beautiful island of Barbados, they were defeated. Thousands of them were massacred as a result of having the audacity to believe that they could overthrow slavery and declare themselves, like Haiti, an independent nation. The hero of that suppression was an English military man, Colonel Codd, and the mayor of the city of London hosted him in one of the finest banquets ever held in the city of London. All of the elite society of London were invited to come and raise a glass of toast to Colonel Codd for defeating the African army in Barbados and the Caribbean. And that was funded, that banquet was funded not only by the city, but with a major endowment from the Earl of Harewood, who was the largest slave owner in the Caribbean at the time, owning over 7 plantations in Barbados, Jamaica, and Tobago. The Drax family also made a substantial donation to that banquet. And it's ironic how, indeed, today we are still talking about the Drax family, because Richard Drax, who is the richest man in the House of Commons, the family that had made its greatest fortune out of slavery in the Caribbean, he sits on that fortune. He sits in the House of Commons, but he was also the result of a family that insisted that there was nothing wrong with enslaving Africans. There was nothing criminal about that, simply because the Africans were not human, and you cannot commit a crime against non-humans. It was the City of London that was able to put together the £20 million to compensate the slave owners within the context of the emancipation legislation. The British government invited the City of London to raise the 20 million to pay reparations to the slave owners as compensation for the state appropriation of their property value in 800,000 enslaved Africans. The City of London, through the Rothschilds Merchant Bank, was able to put together that 20 million to pay the slave owners. No compensation for the enslaved. No compensation for 200 years of free labor from 20 million people. Yes, that's what the British was able to achieve. 200 years of free labor from 20 million Africans who were then set free, penniless and without liberty. These are the crimes that continue to haunt the City of London. The mayors of London established their monuments in every square, on every significant street corner, and every public space. The mayors of the City of London established monuments to these criminals who were able to get away with it because it was said that slavery was in the national interest of Britain. Remember King George saying to Wilberforce, this conversation about emancipation, be very careful. Slavery is in Britain's national interest, so be very careful with the speeches you give in the Parliament. All of this is modern history. This is not ancient history. This is the history of today. When citizens demand that the monuments of these criminals be removed from public spaces in a triumphant civilization of white supremacy, they know what they're speaking about. The mayors of London were the ones who did this. They were the ones who signed the documents to landscape the city, to have it populated with criminals all around us. The mayors have a duty to undo that which they had done. They're the ones who have an ethical responsibility. I note that the University of London is now involved in an effort to research this matter. But this University of London grew upon the profits of slave owners. Slave owners and slave traders made this significant endowments to the University of London to say, we need a university to deal with the education of the children of the middle class, the children of the commercial classes, the children of the industrial classes. We need a university in London to reflect the commercial and financial history of the city, and to do so by sustaining slavery, slave trading, and the colonial enterprise. Which is good that London University is now researching this history. However, the evidence is very clear. Yes, they researched this history. Yes, they present some of the findings of their excellent research. but at the same time, they run away from the consequences of their research. And so we now have a political circumstance called research and run. Research and run has become the standard in British universities, where they look to see the extent to which they drank from the well of slavery, but haven't done the research, haven't collected the evidentiary basis of their own crimes and the way in which the universities participated in these global crimes. Their main impulse is to run away from the consequences of their research. And so research and run has now become the standard within British universities. Reparatory justice is not a part of their agenda. Research and run, not research and repair, not research and restitute, not research and restore. Research and run is the standard refrain and reflects. And so there's a tremendous amount of work to be done, because no university can be excellent if it is also not ethical. There is no university that can claim the value of being excellent if it is marred in behavior that is unethical. And this is our claim. Research and run is not ethical. Neither can it be the basis of an excellent university. Just a week ago, we at the University of the West Indies received the communication from a distinguished British philanthropist by the name of Bridget Freeman. And Bridget wrote to us and said she's been following the narrative on slavery reparations. She's been listening very carefully to the programs. And for the first time in her life as an elderly white British woman, she felt shame and guilt about the legacy of her country in the Caribbean, Africa. And she reached out to us. And she did say she felt ashamed that she was never exposed to this history while she was in school. She was never exposed to this by her public media, and now she's ashamed. She was able then to say, well, I hope this will help, a token gesture. And she made a massive reparations contributions to the student fund, the needy student fund of the University of the West Indies. I wish to thank Bridget Freeman for making that substantial contribution to needy students who are struggling to sustain their connection to university through no fault of their own, simply poverty, the legacy of slavery. And while the British government might continue to claim that they have no responsibility for the consequences of slavery, while they might wish to maintain the view that slavery was a long time ago, while they might wish to maintain the view that they can distance themselves from this crime, it is wonderful to see that civil society, not only the mayor of the City of London and all of the institutions and those who are making an effort to repair this history, it's wonderful to see that they stand apart from the official position of their national government. We have seen history like this before, where citizens are given no choice but to rise up and stand up and to do the right thing, especially as they know that doing the right thing stand in opposition to the views of their own government. So colleagues, I'm honored to be a part of this reflection upon the UNESCO Day, remembrance of slavery and slave trading, this global crime that continues to wreak havoc and harm upon people in this 21st century. This century will be the century of reparations. There is no doubt that reparations is going to be the greatest political movement of this 21st century. There's no doubt about it. The whole world, the whole colonized world, the enslaved world, the brutalized world, the racially oppressed world will put together this movement for justice, and it will be a global movement, and all over the globe, there's going to be demand for reparations. This century, we insist, must be the century of humanity. And if it took us all of the 19th century to eradicate chattel slavery from the world, from Haiti in 1804 to Brazil in 1888, all of the 19th century. And if it took us all of the 20th century to convert emancipation into civil rights and human rights, and if in the process we have lost thousands of our best people in the civil rights movement, the human rights movement, we reflect upon the lives of all of the great heroes of Toussaint L'Ouverture of Haiti. We think of Marcus Garvey, we think of the murder and the assassination of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. We think of the incarceration of Nelson Mandela and all of those others. All of that price that we paid in the 20th century for our human rights and our civil rights. This 21st century is going to be the century of the reparations movement. And we're going to fight to the very end. And if it takes us all of this 21st century, as it took us all of the 20th century, we are going to persist and we are going to triumph. And we know that the City of London, that was at the center of all of this, will rise up and will play its part, will play its role, because we have some very fine people in the City of London who are living their lives and who are committed to justice and freedom. So I thank you all for the generosity of your attention. Thank you very much.
Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, thank you so much for such a clear, unequivocal, insightful, reflective, historical, challenging presentation. Not only did I learn many things that I didn't know before, but also it made me think about, particularly towards the end, the role of the universities. I've just finished working at one of the universities of London that sits on some of that endowment that you've mentioned. And I think their approach is to research and run, and I will be challenging them about their approach. We have a number of questions that have come through. The live chat is buzzing. I've got a few on my tablets here that I'll take first of all, and hopefully we can get through a few of them within the next 10 minutes or so. However, I think we've made a commitment to answer questions, even if we can't do them this evening, that we would actually answer in writing to those people who have submitted that didn't get a chance for their questions to be heard. I was also struck by the role of mayors of London and the challenge now to Sadiq Khan to actually be involved in this campaign to ensure that all Londoners are repaired and receive reparation for the enslavement of their ancestors and the continuing impact of this on our lives. So I just start with the first question that had 14 likes. I'm trying to look at those that had a lot of likes in the first instance. So the question is, should there be a renewed global effort for reparations to countries that suffered the worst of the slave trade? Should reparatory be served to all the descendants of enslaved African people? So there are two questions there from the one person.
Tremendous campaign is being planned at the moment, not only in the Caribbean, but also in the institutions of the United Nations, to establish a global summit on reparations and carry on and many of the facilitating organizations in the UN system, the civil rights and human rights institutions, as well as the Slave Roots Project. We're all hoping that sometime in this year that we will have that summit in Africa in collaboration with the African Union that would bring the global reparations movement together to speak about this matter. I think the argument has been won that reparatory justice is inevitable. The issue is how best to achieve it, who should have the authority to structure and to design and conceptualize what it should look like, and how to ensure that while it has a reparatory function, it is also at the same time creating a greater sense of justice and humanity in the world. And we believe that the reparatory justice movement is a healing movement. We believe it's the way to turn the world in the right direction. So those of us who persist in it are not doing so for limited means. We, of course, have objectives, but we also have the grander philosophical objective of restoring the common humanity of the species. And this is important because as Africans, we have always seen ourselves in that way. Humanity originated in Africa, and whether we like it or not, Africa is the mother of all humanity. And therefore, we will always assign that special role and function to Africa as a symbol of that common humanity. Yes, so there are different methodologies that have been put in place. These are for conversations. In the United States, for example, where people have been plundered in recent years, publicly murdered in recent years, when you link this loss of property and life in the current time against the background, they're demanding an approach that is different from the approach in the Caribbean, which is focused more around development support, development partnership, support for public health, for public education, infrastructural development, so that the poverty that was left in the Caribbean, the poverty left by Britain, the massive colonial mess left in the Caribbean by Britain, that Britain must come back and participate in cleaning up the mess that they have created. All of these problems in the Caribbean, the vast majority of them are legacies of British colonialism. Britain has a duty to come back to the scene of the crime and help to clean up the mess they have left behind. So yes, there are some broad issues and broad approaches, but like all great political and philosophical movements, there is diversity of thought. And that diversity of thought is not a weakness, it's a strength.
Okay, thank you. And just to come back to a point that you made earlier, questions, at least one question's come in about it. I'm sure there are others. And the question is, should descendants of the British trade who were paid taxes in the UK, which were used to repay the 20 million, now receive a refund of all the taxes that have been paid that went towards repaying the debt? As you mentioned earlier, the commission that raised the 20 million to pay those who enslaved us is being paid back by ourselves until very recently. So the question is, should we receive a refund of all the taxes that we've paid, which have gone towards paying the debt?
There's no doubt that this is an immoral act. There's no doubt about it. Within the finest traditions of parliamentary politics and the finest traditions of democratic administration, the fact that my parents, who were a part of the revenue rush and who worked in British industry for 50 years, and that their taxes had to pay to allow that bond to create the interest for those who held the bond over the decades since emancipation. This is an immoral act. I mean, this is the depth to which an empowered class of politicians can sink in their indifference to public sentiment. It is an immorality, and no doubt, the people of the Caribbean, the people of Africa should, their income, their taxes, their fiscal participation should in no way be associated, indeed, with the fact that the British government was still honoring down to 2015 its obligation to that slave bond. And to have a slave bond, our time, our taxes, it's a gross immorality by any standard, especially when you consider that the enslaved themselves in 1833 were calling for compensation. They were saying they had their lobbyists. As that act was working its way through the parliament, the enslaved people were making representations. How about us? We are the ones whose labor was stolen. We're the ones who were criminally brutalized and had our humanity taken from us. This is why we say that the Emancipation Act is the greatest racist act ever passed in the British Parliament. Because the only way the British Parliament could have passed that Emancipation Act was, first of all, to agree in the Parliament that black people were not humans, that they were property. And the Emancipation Act proceeded on the declaration that we were paying property compensation. We were not paying to free people. We were paying property compensation to those who owned the 800,000 enslaved Africans. So the act itself proceeded on the basis that black people were property, were not human, and then proceeded to pay property compensation to those who own legitimately that property. And such an act, again, is a criminal act, that Emancipation Act. It's criminal because it denied human beings their right to their humanity. And then to the double indemnity of paying the reparations to the property owners and not to the enslaved people themselves. And for the British government to continue to persist with the argument that it did nothing wrong, that slavery was not criminal, slavery was not illegal, we did nothing wrong, and we will never apologize. This is the depth of immorality and criminality that has been associated with slavery and compensation to this day. And given the fact that the City of London, its political leadership, its institutions, its financial leadership are all responsible for this, they have a tremendous responsibility to turn this narrative around, to turn it around, and to find itself in the vanguard of democracy and justice.
Thank you, Professor Beckles. And just one final question that I'd like to ask you from our audience. As I mentioned earlier, we will collect all of the questions and hopefully you'll be able to respond to them over the next few weeks. But actually, why do you think that Britain refuses to actually formally acknowledge its part, and not only its part, its leadership role in the perpetuation of the slave trade? What is it that you think that they're scared of? What is it that they're running away from? What is it that they're failing to actually acknowledge, and why? And what do you think we can do in order to push our government to actually acknowledge what they've done, and that they should actually be seriously discussing repair and reparation as part of the conversation?
Well, there are two ways to look at this. One is having created and lived within a civilization that insists that Africans were not human and treated them as such. Having lived upon a culture that has maintained that value system, it is so very difficult for English people to rise above that standard. So very difficult for the British Parliament to rise above a standard it had sustained for 300 years and to create a different epistemic view that says, not only are these African people human, in fact, these African people are superhuman. They're superhuman because they survived this. They maintain their humanity despite of it. They have gone through what no other group of people on planet Earth have gone through, and they have survived and they have maintained their culture, their value system. We are insisting that we have gone through a process of self-repair, and we have done all that we can along the journey to repair the harm done to us. Excuse me. And so we are calling upon them to recognize this. And the best way to recognize this is for them to admit that we implemented the most brutal economic and social system the world has ever known upon these African people, and yet they are here with us, alive and thriving. And therefore, the best way to celebrate this is to come on board, admit to the crimes that they have committed, remove all the doubt that exists in their own political history. And I can tell you, when in Durban in 2001 at the UN Conference on Race and Reparations, I led the Caribbean delegation on this matter. Baroness Amos represented the British government on this matter. And you can very well imagine how we in the Caribbean, how the African delegates felt, how Black people from North America, Latin America, how we all felt when Baroness Amos, beautiful, beautiful, Black, smart, intelligent woman, could look at us, Black people from all over the world, and said, Britain has done nothing wrong and will not apologize. You can imagine how we felt when she was placed in that position. So we're speaking about divide and rule. This is how they have always divided us. This is how they set us apart. This is how they imagine that the young people today will walk away from this conversation. Because their argument is, if we can stay around long enough, the younger generations of Black kids, this history will slip away from them. They will remove themselves from commitment to the conversation. And then, with the matter filtering through the Black community and filtering out of the Black community, this will all be put to rest. But when we hear poets like Nairobi Thompson, and we hear the young people, and we hear the younger people listening, we come to realize that strategy is not going to work. The young people are not going to walk away. They're not going to be de-educated. They're not going to be desensitized. On the contrary, their consciousness is rising and emerging. So that strategy will fail. So basically what we're saying is, this is the time to come to the table to talk about all of this. It can make an enormous difference to the world because it is only a matter of time. It's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when. So let's begin in earnest the diplomatic conversation. The CARICOM countries have invited the British government to have a summit to discuss this matter. The British government continues to speak about aid. We will give you aid, but we don't think that reparatory justice is the right approach. But they should not be telling us that reparatory justice is not the right approach. They should not be saying to us, we will give you more aid. But where did the aid come from in the first place? The aid is like you break into my house and you rob me, and you loot and plunder my riches and my resources. And then I say to you, I want it back. And you say, well, you can't have it back, but I will give you a little part of it by way of aid. I mean, that is the metaphor. We will give you a little part of it back in the form of aid and let the conversation end there. So a 21st century Black consciousness is deeply, deeply offended by the notion that the call for partnership and repair and mutual development and mutual respect concludes in a conversation about aid. It is extremely disrespectful. It is something that Black consciousness in the 21st century will always reject. So it's a non-starter. So let us begin a conversation about development, about mutual respect, about history, about the future. It can be done. We have some fine diplomats in the world who can negotiate this. Britain can only be a better nation. It will only be a better nation when it owns up to its historical circumstances. So long as it remains detached from this history, Britain will be shrinking into a small island nation state in the world. It will not carry that status in the world that it desires until it does the right thing.
Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, I'm not sure how to follow any of what you've just said. You've thrown down the gauntlet to the UK government, to the world, and I know from Black Londoners and Black people around the world and our allies that we will be following your leadership. you talked about the young people, and I was thinking about them before you mentioned that actually young people have a fire in their bellies these days, which actually is not going to dissipate. It's getting stronger and stronger. So I'm sure that they also will be following you, your colleagues, and their younger leaders to ensure that we actually receive justice and restoration. So thank you so much for your presentation and your comments and thoughts and insights. I feel deeply moved by what I've heard this evening, but also I feel even more empowered to move forward and to support those in the world who are actually leading our case for reparations.